an historic peace deal concluded between the United Arab Emirates and the State of Israel marks a great turning point in the history of the modern Middle East. This could be the moment in which the State of Israel, who for 70 years has been isolated from almost all of its neighbours, begins to finally find roots in the region, build long and lasting relationships across the Arab world, and leads towards the process that it has always wanted, that of normalisation. The fact that this has come with the UAE is no great surprise. Israel and many Gulf states have been improving their relationships over the last 15 years. Indeed, covert relationships, which had been building in the early 2000s, became overt relationships. Israeli ministers have visited Oman. They visited the UAE. They've had public contacts now with Saudi Arabia, with Qatar, with Bahrain, all of whom seem to be moving in a general direction, which is recognition of Israel. So this isn't a great surprise, but it is an important time, and we need to understand what's going on and why it's happening now. Firstly, of course, the Gulf Arab states, generally speaking, see Iran and the presence of Iran in the region as a threat, as does Israel. There's much common cause there. Secondly, economic relationships which have been developing between Israel and the Gulf states are even more important in this time of the coronavirus, in which traditional economic patterns are being disrupted. Thirdly, it's becoming increasingly clear that technology transfer and the ability to move human capital between the Gulf states and Israel has been increasingly important for the security of both, whether domestically or in the foreign policy sphere. And as regional competition heats up between the UAE, Turkey, and Egypt, spreading into the Eastern Mediterranean and Libya, the UAE is looking for friends, and of course Israel is looking for friends, and they found common cause. There's a US general election coming up, and it's of no great surprise that the Americans, particularly the Trump administration, have used this as a moment to show how they have had a diplomatic success and that it was them that take the glory from this field. So all in all, it benefits many sides. There are not very many downsides to it. The UAE, I doubt, will face much domestic blowback, and indeed, even in the region where it has deep rivalries with Qatar and Turkey, it's unlikely that its relationships will be harmed any further, given that those rivalries are already long-standing and deeply in place. Additionally, the prospect of a Biden administration and the fact that a Biden administration may well re-engage with Iran on the JCPOA concerns the UAE, it concerns Saudi Arabia, and they will be looking to create some leverage across the region where they have friendships that can backstop their diplomatic activities and their concerns, which deter Iran in the long run and which allow them to stand by themselves in an era in which the US is just not the partner that it used to be. The one card here that we really don't know is the Palestinians. If you're Mahmoud Abbas right now, this is going to feel a very powerful but ultimately isolating moment. The Palestinians have long looked to their Arab brothers in the Gulf for financial support and diplomatic support, and what it looks to me is that the Arab states in that region are increasingly moving towards a recognition of Israel and trying to balance that with the ongoing occupation of Palestinian land. It does seem that the Arab states in the Gulf are able to separate those two questions increasingly, and indeed view the Palestinian issue as not the primary issue that perhaps they used to. And so I think, given that, the Palestinian Authority is going to be running out of friends and looking for allies elsewhere. They may find that in Recep Tayyip Erdogan. But ultimately, this is, I think, a historical change in the way in which Arab politics is conducted, or more be a reflection of a change in which Arab politics is conducted. I think that is a positive. If you are Jewish, you can now worship openly in Bahrain, in the UAE. And historical Jewish presence that was in the Arabian Peninsula is now being recognised once again, so that is definitely a positive. But if you are a Palestinian, however, I think this is a concerning moment, and it may well be the beginning of the end of a quest for Palestinian statehood.